Okay, so I know that the camera looks funky, but it's just because I've had to change my recording situation. But this should all be the same. So here's chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 7. At the station. The bunch of us being marched into the station was as embarrassing as anything I'd ever experienced. Charlie made me go in first, and I must have been a sorry sight. Head hanging, shoes scruffing the floor. He hadn't put cuffs on us or anything, but it felt like he had. I'd never been so ashamed, and I'd never resented anyone so much as I resented Joe Conley and the other guys, though I guess that was kind of unfair. My dad was standing there. He knew what we'd done. I expected his face to be red to bursting, but he just pulled me aside and whispered, "I expect you know why those boys asked you and Percy along for this." It wasn't a whooping, I suppose, but it was almost worse. He'd know we'd been used, and that we should have known better. "Your parents are coming to get you," my dad said as we stood lined up against the wall and window at his office. "So we're not in trouble?" Morgan asked. "I would guess you'll be in plenty, but not from the law. This was stupid, boys. Stupid and disrespectful. The Federal Bureau is sending out their investigators in the morning, and after that, I'm sending Charlie and Bert out to get rid of everything out there. The rug, the chalk." My dad frowned at me. "Anything that would have been worth gawking at." Down the line, a few guys teared up again, and I almost spoke. It hadn't been about that for them. It had been about Steve. Sheriff Jensen, sir," said Joe Conley. "My dad's on shift at the seed factory." "Don't worry, we already put a call in. He's on his way." "He's leaving his shift?" Percy and I looked at each other. At school, we all knew that Joe's father was mean as a snake, that despite Joe's height and athletic build, he would sometimes show up in the locker room with bruised ribs and strange marks on his back. "Can you call and stop him?" Percy asked. "The old man has to come from there too, and my old man has to come from there too, and he won't mind. We could bring Joe home, and then I could drive my car, and he wouldn't make me leave it." "Percy," my dad said, "shut up." After that he left us, to stew, I guess, all of us standing there and waiting for the axe to fall. One by one we were taken away, wincing at the storm clouds on our father's brows, and envious of the ones who were picked up by their mothers, even if Jake Clapper's mom did thump him with her handbag something fierce. Pretty soon it was only Joe, Morgan, Percy, and me. "Hey," Percy hissed to me. "What?" "You should tell your dad about the face." The face he'd seen in the window out at the Carlson's farmhouse. "You're sure it wasn't Charlie?" I asked. He shook his head. "Couldn't have been. It was already gone when we heard Charlie pulled up. And it didn't look like him. No hat." "Well, who did it look like?" But he couldn't say. I asked him about it often over the coming weeks, but at the end he couldn't be sure if what he saw was a person. I took a deep breath and went over to my dad. "What is it, Michael?" "I don't think we were the only ones at the Carlsons tonight. Percy says he saw someone else, standing outside looking in through the living room window." He reached up and rubbed his eyes and forehead. He was still exhausted, and I felt guiltier than ever. "But no one else in the house?" he asked. "Not that we saw." "All right, I'll send Charlie back out to take a look around. And Nancy," he called from the room to her, "will you call out to State Patrol and see if they'll give us a hand with a 24-hour watch on the Carlson house?" "Will do." He turned back to me. "Anything else?" "No, sir," I said, and returned to my place against the wall. "I'm sorry we got you into this, Jensen," Joe said. "You didn't get me into anything, and it was going to be worse for him anyway." It was another hour before Joe's dad showed up. He walked in looking irritated, but as soon as he saw my father, he shook his hand and apologized for the whole mess. Even thanked him for being so understanding about it since Joe was so broken up about Steve. They made small talk for a few minutes, chuckling about their delinquent sons, Joe's father shaking his head amiably, his big, broad shoulders still built like he played football. That niceness was what made him dangerous. If he'd have been a drunk and a screw-up like Mo, none of us would have been afraid to talk. But to say Joe's father was cruel? Who would have believed us? As he and my dad were talking, the door to the interrogation room across the station opened, and Marie Hill stepped out with Edwin Porter, our public defender. We all stared, and Mr. Porter tried to hurry her along, but she put her hand on his arm. I didn't know what was going to happen as she stood there facing us. I was afraid that Joe and Morgan, and maybe even Mr. Conley, would start shouting at her, demanding to know what she knew. Maybe that's what would have happened if there hadn't been so few of us left by then. Instead, Mr. Conley broke the stillness by walking to his son and taking him by the collar. Marie's eyes narrowed as the Conleys left the station, like she sensed that something wasn't right. I wonder what else she'd heard, how much she knew about why we were there and what we'd done. We hadn't heard any sound from inside the interrogation room, but I'd been in there and I knew it wasn't soundproof. Mr. Porter tried to guide Marie back towards the stairs that led to her cell, but she tugged a little against him and stared through the windows that faced the parking lot. Then her eyes narrowed again, and she looked at me and motioned with her chin. I knew immediately what she'd meant. Joe's dad hadn't bothered to wait until they got home. He'd pulled him into a dark spot beside the building. I pushed off the wall and went to the window. I could see them, just the shapes of them pressed against the wall. "Dad!" I called him over and he looked. Then he pushed through the door, with Charlie not far behind. "Stay inside, the rest of you," Charlie ordered. He pointed to Mr. Porter and Marie. "And get her back up to her cell." Nancy got to her feet behind the receptionist's desk and hurried to help, a set of keys jangling in her hands. "Come on, dear," she said, and I couldn't tell whether she was speaking to Marie or Mr. Porter, a small man with a bald pate and wisps of dark hair. She ushered them through the station towards the stairs, and Marie looked over her shoulder at me. "What do you think's happening out there?" Percy asked. It had gone quiet after my dad's initial shouts. Then it started again, and we heard a new voice join in. "Oh, Christ, it's Mo," Percy groaned. "He's about to make things worse." But he didn't. Though Mo can sometimes complicate things, he also has a knack for speeding things up, and within 2 minutes he and my dad came back inside the station with Joe walking between them. Joe was crying, and his nose and lips were bloody. In the parking lot, Mr. Conley started his car and drove away. "Should have dragged him in here and thrown him in a cell," Mo said angrily. "Next time," my dad said, "if there's a next time. For now, he can stay with us," Morgan said. "We're used to it." "Is that all right with you, son?" my dad asked, and Joe nodded. "I don't know what's keeping my mom," said Morgan. "My dad has the car, but she can usually ask our neighbor. Percy and I'll take them," Mo said. "You boys ride with me in the truck, and Percy can follow behind in that rust bucket car of his." "All right," my dad said. "I'll call Mrs. Todd and tell her to expect you." It wasn't long after they left that my dad gave up his silent treatment and led me out to the cruiser to go home. "Thanks for doing that, Dad," I said as we drove. It was a search for the right word. Brave, heroic, good. "It was nothing," he said softly. Then he shook his head and patted my knee. "I didn't mean that. It wasn't nothing. It was just another bad thing." "But, Dad, it's all right. I know we can't fix all of it, but it would be nice, right now, to just fix one." That night, long after the rest of my family was asleep, I sat awake in my bedroom thinking about the Carlson place. The empty rooms, like time, had stopped. The dark pools of blood soaked into the carpet, and that strange red circle the size of a girl. Every bloodless murder had more questions than answers. But these were questions about people we knew. I imagined Steve lying with his throat cut across from his mother and his expression of disbelief as they both died. I imagined his father trying to protect everyone, except that it didn't seem he had. He had lain down right beside them, and his face had formed a similar, quiet stain. And his blood had formed a similar, quiet stain. When I finally slept, in my dreams, I was inside that house. Only Steve's father was my father, and my mother and Dawn were standing in the Carlson living room on top of that stained carpet. In the dream, I couldn't save them. In the dream, they were standing there, but they were already dead. Chapter 8. Monsters. As penance for what I'd done, and not at all to eavesdrop, I spent a lot of time that weekend sweeping up and doing chores around the jail. And after a little while, Bert and Charlie stopped treating me like I was in trouble and things went back to normal. Normal enough that Nancy, our receptionist, didn't think it strange to ask to ask me to go upstairs and see Marie. What for? I asked. Nancy shrugged. She heard you were here and asked for you. I don't see much harm in it as long as you don't stay too long. She glanced out the windows. It would be growing dark soon. Everyone's mother wanted them home before dark those days. I made my way through the building, past the empty offices and the corridor that led to the men's cells, also empty, as if even the drunks were respectfully restraining themselves on account of the murders. I mounted the steps to the women's cell and my old house with its white painted door. It occurred to me that Marie and I were nearly the only two people inside the whole place. It was irresponsible of Nancy to let me go. She hadn't even asked Charlie for the okay, but Nancy was beautiful enough to be famous, and as such, she pretty much had her run of things. Not to mention, after her personal tragedy, Nancy had lost her little girl in a house fire some years back, along with her husband. Not even my dad had the heart to scold her. I knocked on the door to the women's cell. When I got no reply, I opened it a fraction and said, "Marie?" "Yes." "May I come in?" I pushed the door a little farther, wide enough to see a sliver of her back. She was seated on her bed in another pair of blue jeans and possibly the same white shirt. "This isn't my room, Michael," she said. "It's a jail. You don't need to ask permission." I hesitated. When it became clear that I was unable to move without say so, she said, "And I did ask you to come, so come in." She had her hair down again, brushed back from her face. One knee was drawn up, hands folded in front of it with her fingers intertwined. She was staring at the window, though from that angle she wouldn't have been able to see much but a few treetops and some sky. I stepped into the room and awkwardly shuffled about, trying to decide whether to stand or to pull a chair over from the kitchen. "You don't smell like beer anymore," she said, "like you did the other night." "Oh," I said, and wiped my chest like the scent was still there and would come off. "I'm sorry." She shrugged. "I'm used to it. Maybe it even reminds me of home." "Where is home?" "Nebraska," she said. "You know that." But by then, Nebraska was only a guess. No one had been able to locate a girl by the name of Marie Catherine Hale, and there were no girls reported missing who matched her description, aside from a few runaways whose families would later shake their heads when they were shown Marie's picture, disappointed and also relieved. She turned on her bed, and the moment barely caused a shift in the thin mattress, the edges of which were carefully made with what my mother called hospital corners. She looked up and down. "Though none of the fellows I knew walked around smelling like beer and a necktie." I remembered what we were wearing that night, her church clothes from attending the funerals. "The funerals were that day." "Oh," she said. She didn't ask about the Carlsons' funerals, not the whole time she was with us. It might have seemed macabre if she did. Perverse. At times during our conversations I wondered whether she realized that, and the omission was deliberate. She did, however, ask if I knew them. "You must have," she said, "in a small kind of town like this." "I did. Steve was in my year at school." "What was he like?" "Steve? He was nice, and he played football. Tight end, I think." "And you knew him a long time?" "Since first grade, at least." "What else?" "What do you mean?" "What else can you tell me about him?" I don't know if I should, and at that point there wasn't much more to tell. It was still too soon for the folks of Black Deer Falls to have mind each other's memories, to revisit our every interaction with the Carlsons and go through their belongings until we all felt like better friends. And being there with Marie felt wrong, talking about his life with the girl who had been found slicked with his and his parents' blood, even though it was hard to believe that she had anything to do with it. Every time I looked at her, my brain wrestled with the sight of her the same way any jury would have. She couldn't have done it. She wouldn't. She was too small, too young, too pretty, and she was a girl. Only her accomplice could make it make sense. After we had him, then we could look on her as we pleased, casting her as the frightened hostage or the present-day Bonnie Parker who seduced him into it and egged him on. Marie sighed. She stretched her arms over her shoulders, and something in the stretch made me look away, as if it was too intimate. I thought again that we were alone, and I had really been alone with this girl except on dates to the drive-in or the cafe. You didn't bring any smokes, did you? I forgot. Next time, I promise. Next time, she said quietly. Well then, what did I ask you here for? I watched her as she tucked her knees up under her chin and hugged her legs. How many times had I seen my little sister Dawn sitting on the porch swing just the same way? Her little brow furrowed, eyes narrow to slits and hard as marbles, thinking unknowable young girl's thoughts. But Marie Hill had far more secrets than Dawn. There were so many things I wanted to ask. How did the murders happen? Why were there no signs of struggle? Why were they chosen? Where was the blood? Always, where was the blood? It seemed impossible that she could know. Do you believe in monsters, Michael? Monsters? Not since I was 7. 7. That's pretty old, too, I guess. But it's not right either. Deep down, we all believe in monsters. Her gaze drifted back to the window. Before this is over, you won't believe the kinds of things you'll hear about me. Maybe even about your friend Stephen. He'll be the one they focus on, you know. Not his old father or his adult mother. Just him. So young and handsome, and that little baby so tragically left behind. She snorted. Like it'd been better if... Marie stopped. She didn't like talking about that baby. She never wanted to hear about Patricia, except for once, weeks later, when she asked if the aunt who took her in had really wanted her. Did your friend Stephen date a lot? Did he get around? I thought it was an odd way to phrase it. Boys didn't get around. He dated some. Nice girls mostly. Mostly? She asked. Isn't that the only kind you have here? She slid her hands down her legs and fiddled with the rolled cuffs of the jeans she wore. She looked nervous. No, not nervous. Restless. Like it was taking all of her restraint to stay on the cot. I wish I'd smoked. I'd have given her one just to calm her down. It won't matter anyway, she said. Who he dated. They'll find everything out. Where they went. What they did in the backs of cars. Because even the nice girls do something. Maybe they'll keep the details out of the papers, but they'll hint, like they did with those 2 nurses. Just a small note that they were regulars at the Roadhouse, and had many acquaintances there. Acquaintances. Damn reporters. Shockingly, she spit on the floor. You've been following the papers? Of course we were, but it isn't just the reporters. It's everyone, if the victim is young or beautiful. Such a tragedy, they say. Such a loss. That's how it starts. She cocked her head cockish. Then they changed their tune. Not enough to be defamatory, just enough to make folks wonder. What could something so beautiful have done to deserve it? No one could deserve that, I said quietly. I know. She sighed and put her feet down. But it doesn't stop them from wondering. Have you ever heard of Mercy Lena Brown? I shook my head. She was a girl from Exeter, Rhode Island, who lived in the 1800s. She died when she was 19, and shortly after, her neighbors became convinced that she was returning from the grave and draining the life from her brother. So they dug her back up and cut her apart. They cut off her head so she wouldn't rise again, then burned her heart in the town square and fed her poor brother the ashes. That's... I said as my mind struggled to recall what little I knew of New England. Hadn't the Salem witch trials been not long before that? Wasn't the whole region prone to fits of hysteria, with each citizen granted a torch and pitchfork upon reaching majority age? That's ghoulish and ridiculous. I suppose it was, said Marie, but it wasn't to them. At the time, I had never heard of Mercy Brown. It sounded made up, a folk legend. but it wasn't. It was one of many fear-induced exhumations peppered throughout New England and even stretching into the Midwest. When I was researching it, I actually found some references to exhumations in Minnesota. Tuberculosis is what she died of, Marie said. A doctor said that when they cut her open, but no one cared. They fed her tubercular heart to her brother anyway, and they did it with their father's permission. She smiled a little at those final words. Did it save him? I asked. The brother? No, it didn't save him, Michael. She shook her head at me. He joined her in the cemetery, not 6 months later. Of course, they left him whole. We both laughed a little. I was embarrassed to have asked. You know, I said, Steve wasn't really my friend. I figured. You two didn't seem a match type. She leaned back and stretched her neck. The prosecutor from Nebraska is on his way, she said and raised her nose like she could catch his scent. I guess they're going to charge me there too. They must be finding my footprints and fingerprints everywhere, putting it all together. Why didn't you just tell them who was with you? I asked. Why didn't you just give him up? Because, she said simply, it wouldn't do any good. After that, I went back downstairs. Nobody saw me coming back from the woman's cell, or if they did, they didn't say anything, maybe to save themselves the headache of telling my dad. I walked over to Charlie as he sat at his desk doing paperwork and pretending not to steal glances at Nancy. Charlie? Yeah, Michael? Did you go back out to the Carlson farm last night to have a look around? Right after you and your dad left for home. Didn't find anything. No other tire tracks, no evidence that anyone had been messing with the doors. No footprints in the flower beds? Not a one. And I checked all around the house, not just where you said by the living room window. I even woke poor Fern Thompson to ask if she'd heard anything, so she won't thank you for that. Okay, thanks anyway, I said softly. I went home that night and didn't think anything more of Percy's face in the window. At that time, it was easy enough to believe it had all been in his imagination.